Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now for a while I've wanted to go back to a slightly simpler method of doing things, which is kind of the core of what I've been trying to do on the channel since day one. Everything you see here, these are the Wastelanders from Anvil Industry, and I'll make sure that there's links in the description to where you can go and grab these. There's both physical cast resin, so if you don't have a printer like I do, you can pick those up, but these came off of a Mars 4, and I'm pretty pleased with the results. Now everything here is just a simple base coat, dry brush, and a wash. And I'm going to take you through the method how you can paint a rebel. I've done similar before with rats, so follow along and let's get these guys on the table. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So once your miniatures are all assembled, it's time to prime them, and black primer. I've used here matte black from the Army Painter. It literally does not matter. Any black paint will do the job here. You could even use a very dark brown if that's what you happen to have handy, but black is what I've used, and hopefully you're going to see why in a moment here. Because our first step is going to be to grab some brown. I have here German Camo black brown, which is really dark. The idea is the darker here, the better. We just don't want this fella to be completely black. So what I'm doing, you'll see, is very quick. This is overbrushing. It's quite a lot like dry brushing, except we don't bother to take much paint off the brush at all, because I want them to be mostly brown. Only the very darkest recesses are going to stay black, and if they don't, honestly, it doesn't matter. You know, if you do splurge a little and you end up with too much on your brush, he ends up proper brown in the recesses. Doesn't matter. You'll see how quick this goes on. Now, if you are painting 4 or 5 of these guys at a time, by the time you put the brown on the 5th bloke, the first one is going to be ready for this step. Just make sure you do let it sit and settle. What I've got is one of my cheap raggedy makeup brushes, and I have leather brown from the Army Painter. Again, don't worry too much about specifically what brown you're using. Just a nice mid-tone will work best here. This, we're now going to be a little bit more careful in how we dry brush it over, because we do want to leave a little bit more of that slightly darker brown in the recesses. Nonetheless, you can probably see what's happening here. We're getting a little bit more depth to our miniature here. Now the idea with this is that when we come back and we start applying colors to them, anywhere that we either miss or we just don't want to paint, you'll find that you have a grimy brown in the recesses, and that works just fine, especially for your raider types. So a couple of passes. Anywhere that you want to be specifically brown later, you can concentrate, pass over the area a few times. But yeah, as brown as you fancy here, until you're satisfied. There we go, proper grimy. Now, with most miniatures like this, I like to start by painting the skin. So what I've got here, if you've got the Fanatic Mega set from the Army Painter, what you'll have is topaz skin and barbarian flesh. Now, I tend to find topaz skin a little too dark for this by itself, and barbarian flesh a little too light. So you might see what's going on here. I've mixed them, roughly half and half. Doesn't need to be precise, this is just for a base coat. And if you are picking up paints individually, you can use whatever color you fancy for your base coat here. I just mention it because mixing those two together, you get something that approximates tanned flesh, which is pretty much my go-to. Anyhow, you'll see this covers fairly well, but we will need a second coat, especially over that big chrome dome. Now, after a couple of coats, your skin tone's going to look like that. If you're painting Children of the Atom, you're pretty much done, aren't you? Now what I have done is added just a little bit more barbarian flesh to the mix. This step isn't strictly necessary, but depending on the miniature, I quite like to sort of bulk out some of the skin. So this isn't strictly a highlight, but I am leaving just a little bit of my base coat in the recesses and fairly quickly lightening up other parts of the skin tone. You don't have to do this if you are planning on highlighting the skin later, but I find adding a little bit of depth, like particularly to skin and faces, things like that, will add quite a lot to your finished miniature, even though we are painting it fairly quickly. Now the next step that I like to do is to apply the metallics. And for this I want quite dark and grimy, so I am using gunmetal from the Army Painter. Now this will go on pretty well, and it's really a case of how much of this you want to add is enough, because some of these plates, like on his leg here, these look more like they would be plastic or something similar, whereas you do also have big chunky, very clearly metallic bits on some parts of his armor. So it's up to you if you do go the route of everything is modern plastic or some of it is recovered metal. It's your choice. Some bits are very obviously metal. Now, particularly on the gun, what you can do is just quickly flick over the surface and leave deliberately some of that brown in the recesses, which will give you a real funky, beaten up gunmetal color. Okay, now comes the fun part. Basically, pick yourself 4 colors. Now, I'm using Army Green, Wyvern Fury, Angel Green, and Deep Gray. There's a couple of browns that I'm going to use later on as well, but just pick 3 or 4 colors, and what they're going to do is be your trousers, your shirts, and a few armor plates. This fella's bandana, for example. So you may have seen on the other guys, they both have red shirts, which was a slight oversight on my part. So I'm going to start with deep gray, and I'm going to pick this dude's shirt to be gray. Now obviously at the moment I'm just painting this one guy, but while you are painting a group, you paint this dude's shirt gray, then the trousers gray on the other fella, then maybe a couple of armor plates, these plastic things, paint those gray on the third dude. And just by cycling through these colors, this is how you do it quicker. You don't have to think about, ooh, what's my color selection going to be like? Because I find that slows me down a lot. Now, I haven't done any fellas with brown trousers yet, so I'm going to turn back to leather brown, which we did use as our dry brush. But you'll see by applying it neat, we get a much brighter, obviously more solid color. So let's get that done. You see how different that looks? Even to his boots. His boots were just dry brushed with that, and a solid layer really helps the color difference. Now what I've got is Army Green. Now this one, I have done green trousers on one fella, and I did a green like scrapper cloth hanging from the leg of the other. So this guy, I'm going to put it up higher on the miniature and paint in his bandana with it. Now Wyvern Fury is a really nice deep red. The color marking on the bottle, it says cool red. Yeah, it's cool. I'm going to paint in this armor plate here, and as well he's got a couple of little which look like undersuit bits up here, which a little splash of red will not hurt. Now at this point I don't want to keep adding more colors because it will start looking garish rather than random. So instead what I'm going to start turning to is a couple more browns and this beige here. This is Dorado's Skin. And it actually works super well as like a linen kind of color. It will require 2 coats. Like going on, it will look fairly bright. But as it settles and dries, you're going to see a little of the primer come through. So a second coat won't hurt. I'm going to pick a few bits to paint with this. Now 2 coats of Dorado's Skin. We've got that funky linen color. I also quickly bopped in a little bit of it across his teeth, and I did pop some Wyvern Fury, the red stuff, on, I guess it is his bottom teeth, but I always prefer a sort of, a tongue rather than the 2 sets of teeth thing. Just looks a little odd to me. Anyhow, what I'm going to move on to now is both fur brown and oak brown. Now I'm not mixing these. What I am going to use them for is to break up some of the brown on the miniature that we've got so far. So some of those bits, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to leave the leather brown in the recesses, but some parts I'll paint in fur brown, which is a nice reddish leather color. And then to complement that lighter brown that we've just applied, I'm going to put oak brown on, which is a little bit darker, has a nice chocolatey sort of color to it. So a few bits, the strap across his chest, his goggles and what have you, and then the rest I'm just going to leave the leather brown that we dry brushed earlier. Now the last thing that I'm going to apply before doing a dry brush and a wash over this guy is going to be some matte black. But I have added just the tiniest dot of that deep grey from earlier into it. Reason being is a true black. I tend to find looks a little jarring on stuff like this. And as well, if it's got a tiny touch of grey to it, when we shade it, it might actually still be visible. So I'm going to paint in his boots and the tire section that this fella has on his shoulder. And of course, if you want to paint in black vests or what have you, it is up to you. Now at this point, if you've got any tidy up that you want to do, go ahead and do it now. I would recommend try and let the general grubbiness of the miniature do some of that for you, so you don't have to fuss with it, but you might have a few bits that you do want to, like a face or a shirt or something, you want to tidy up. It's up to you. Anyhow, what I have here is my big old chunky dry brush again, and I have Ancient Stone. Now this is going to look pretty intense going on, so I'm just going to brush the edge of his base for a feel of what I'm going to leave behind, and then very, 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 very lightly pass over edges to highlight very lightly. On his back here is probably going to be slightly easier to see. What I'm doing here, the Ancient Stone has kind of a beige, it's a very light beige ivory sort of tone. And being light with it as I am, we get almost a translucent color at the edges where I'm trying to highlight by not doing any work. You can pass over metal work with this. Don't worry too much, it'll just look a little bit dusty. And funnily enough, you can also go over his skin with it too, because it's quite close to Dorado's skin. So it's almost going to give you a highlight to his skin straight away. So you want to be a little bit more bold with this than you might expect. But once you're satisfied with it, we're ready for the next step. There we go. Now you see what I mean about being a little braver with it than you might think. And as well, you might even see how it kind of works as a highlight for the skin. That's not too bad. What we're going to do now is to shade him though. And what I've done is mixed up. This is a mix which does work better when you've got, like I said, 4 or 5 of these to paint at a time. This is 10 drops of strong tone and 5 drops of speed paint medium. So it's not quite a 2-to-1 mix. You can experiment with this if you want to have a play around with it though. All the same, the whole point of the speed paint medium is to help it flow and to thin out that rather stark, strong tone finish. So you'll see I'm just splurging it over to start with. And then, once I've got most of it off my brush, I can start shifting it around where I need it to be. So you can be fairly generous with this, but what's important is that you don't miss anywhere. Over the entire miniature, and then we'll give him about half an hour to dry, find somewhere warm in the sun. If you remember what that looks like, let's get a look at what he looks like when this has dried. Now once that's dried, isn't it just night and day? It's not going to win you any painting competitions for sure, but I really like how that turns out. For something to put on the table and play games with, I'm more than happy with that. And it's a style that I've really wanted to get back to for quite a while. So having the Wastelanders, yeah, that's been quite a neat treat. What I'm going to do though is a couple of extra little steps here, just because I want them to look extra cool. So what I have, this is red leather from Vallejo, and I've watered this down to the point it basically looks like a shade. I would recommend if you're doing this for the first time, more water, like too much water, isn't going to matter. Too much water, you can just apply a second coat of this where you want it to look rusty. But not enough water, what you're going to do is just paint red leather onto the miniature, which might not be what you want. So little bits of this at joints and what have you. Up on his gun, just remember that some of these parts are going to be moving quite regularly, so don't paint those bits rusty. But yeah, you can have some fun with this now. Anywhere where you want to add just a little bit of visual interest to the steel or iron that you've painted, just a wee bit of this thinned out in the recesses and even on some of the flat areas will do the job. Now that is fairly subtle once that dries, but what I'm going to do is grab a nice bright metallic color. I've got here plate mail metal, even a silver will work, and what I'm going to do is just a few little dings of this to make some of the corners look a bit scratched and fresh. Particularly over areas where you have painted the rust, if you do a little bit of this bright silver, it's going to look like it's been recently knocked around. So add as much or as little of this as you like. And then the very last thing I'm going to do is to get a little bit of greedy gold, and I'm just going to dot in some of the bits of the bullets on his leg here, because I definitely didn't forget these. Anyhow, once I'm finished with this, what I'm going to do is hit him with a matte varnish. And as always, I recommend just find one that you like and buy a few bottles of it. You know, always stock up on something that you know you like using. I'm going to use Instar's Varnish Plus. Gets my vote, but like I said, anything goes. Then I'm going to go ahead and pop his base on him too. And the recipe for that will be in the description. So let's get a look at all of the group once they are all together. And so there at last, our Wastelanders or Raiders are complete. And this little group, 5 miniatures, probably took me about 2.5 hours at a push. Now, that is including drying time for the most part. Just the bases do take a little bit longer because you want to make sure that the goop on them is thoroughly dry before you start dry brushing them. But there we have it. Nice and simple. Maybe not going to break any records on appearance, but these guys are going to look great on the table. And they certainly filled the bill for I needed some Raiders for Fallout. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.